next to you. How about that? Thank you.
So you guys can start from put on back first?
Yeah, I guess so. No, I don't think so. No. I'm saying, like, if we go start one on Tuesday and just have a little bit of time, like I was thinking, just go there and there, finish out the day, you know, start with the doctor. I was trying about 7 or 4 today, but we'll have to discuss that one. Yeah. Thank you very much.
So drop it.
Yeah.
You're right up there.
Yeah.
Next witness.
Dr. Randall Williams.
Okay.
Ready for the jury?
Yeah, please.
Just made two of us approach.
Yeah.
Three, I have met.
Next the defense calls Dr. Randall Williams.
Sir, if you would stand right here for a moment. Face this clerk, raise your right hand, prepare to take the oath.
You do solemnly swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Now, sir, if you would, step right over here, have a seat in the red chair. Make yourself comfortable, speaking loud and clear voice for me, and step up, slide up that mic.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon. Can you tell the jury your name, please?
Yes, my name is George Randall Williams, MD.
And how
How are you employed, sir?
I am an employee of the North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center in Gainesville, Florida.
How long have you worked there?
Approximately 8 years.
You mentioned MD at the end of your name. What kind of medical doctor are you?
I'm a board-certified psychiatrist, board-certified in general and forensic psychiatry.
I'll briefly check on your education. Where did you go to college?
I'm from San Antonio, Texas, and I attended Texas A&M University, where I received 2 degrees, a Bachelor of Science in Chemistry and a Master of Science in Biochemistry. I attended Baylor College of Medicine for 2 years, working on a PhD, but left that program to enter medical school at the University of Texas at Galveston. Following that, I went to University of Florida, in residency training in psychiatry.
Right. And after your residency training at the University of Florida, are you then a full-fledged psychiatrist, so to speak?
Well, I've had a license in the state of Florida since 1979. So I've been a licensed physician since 1979.
And you mentioned this, but explain to me what does board certified mean?
Completion of a residency program qualifies you or makes you eligible for board certification. Subsequent testing, both oral and written, qualifies an individual for that assignation as board certified. You can go on further after you're getting your general board certification and get specialty certifications such as child and adolescence or addiction psychiatry. In my case, I received further certification in forensic psychiatry.
And what's forensic psychiatry? What's the forensic part of it mean?
The word forensic pertains to any profession. It's interface between its profession and the law.
Okay. So, forensic law.
Yes, forensic is an adjective and can apply to pathologists or metallurgists or physicists. So a forensic psychiatrist is a psychiatrist who has further qualifications at the interface between that profession and the law.
And your board certification, who certifies you?
This is the American Board of Psychiatry and Neurology and Psychiatry.
Now, is that certification last forever, or do you have to get recertified?
The original general psychiatry certification was early enough in my career to be enabled for a lifetime certification. Starting around 1990, any certification had to be renewed every 10 years, and so I have received original forensic psychiatry and 1 recertification. I've been certified now for 19 years.
Okay, so you were certified and recertified. Tell me, your hospital, where is it located?
The east side of Gainesville, Florida.
And are you a full-time employee there?
Yes, yes, sir.
Am I paying you any money to come down here and testify?
Only through your taxes to the state of Florida, sir.
So no more than anybody else in this room?
That's correct, sir.
Have you had an opportunity to testify in court before?
Yes, sir.
And in those times that you testified in court, were you offered as an expert?
Yes, sir.
What areas were you offered as an expert?
In the areas of guardianship and also in competency.
and is, how many times do you think?
Guardianship, probably 30 times approximately, and competency probably 15 to 20 times.
Judge, I would offer Dr. Williams as an expert in forensic psychiatry.
Don't do that one anymore. Any more dire?
No, Judge.
Okay, let's proceed.
Doctor, is it your understanding that you're going to offer any opinion today as to whether Mr. Jonchuck was insane at the time of the offense?
No, sir. I've never examined Mr. Jonchuck for that purpose, nor will I render an opinion today or any time in the future.
I want to talk to you about your duties at the hospital as they related to Mr. Jonchuck. When Mr. Jonchuck arrived at your hospital, what's the process that you and the hospital go through?
Yes, sir. We have a quite involved admission process. The individual is transferred from custody of the sheriff department to our facility, at which time they're offered opportunity to take care of hygiene needs. They're followed up by examination and history by our primary care physicians, who detect and recommend treatment for any medical problems that the individual may have. Also, our dietitian interviews them for any particular dietary needs or supplement needs. The laboratory blood is drawn and an electrocardiogram is obtained. After that is completed, the recovery team, which consists of myself, a registered nurse, a behavior specialist, a counselor, and a quality assurance personnel, assemble and interview the individual from a psychiatric incompetency point of view.
And is there a psychologist involved sometimes?
Yes, sometimes. The behavioral specialist is a part of the psychology department. We do have a psychologist that enters into the evaluation process, but not always at the time of admission.
And as the psychiatrist, let me make sure I got this right. What's your title at the hospital?
My title is senior physician.
Okay. And so then at that intake process, are you the guy in charge?
I'm the titular head of the recovery team.
Okay. And that's what happened in Mr. Jonchuck's case? He went through that process?
Yes, twice.
All right. How long does that initial process last?
That could last for many hours.
All right. And is it at that time that you develop a diagnosis for Mr. Jonchuck?
Yes.
And at the time that you had that intake, what was your diagnosis?
My initial impression for Mr. Jonchuck at his first admission was schizophrenia.
Okay. Is schizophrenia a mental illness?
Yes.
And is it, you have in front of you a purple book there, the DSM-5. What's that?
This is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It is produced by the American Psychiatric Association. They put an issue out every 5 to 10 years, and this is the 5th version of that book.
And is that considered the, I don't know, how do we describe that? The gold standard? What is that as far as the diagnosis of mental illness?
It is central and primary and associated with the international system of diagnoses also. So it is the key reference point that psychiatry, psychology, and other professions use in respect to diagnosis.
All right. Now, at the time of Mr. Jonchuck's admission, what are some of the symptoms that allowed you to form that diagnosis?
You allow me to refer to notes for completeness, please.
Please do.
At the time of admission, Mr. Jonchuck exhibited marked thought blocking. This is a cognitive impairment in which thoughts are unable to be processed straightforwardly and smoothly. He had ideas of reference. This is when an individual takes a coincidence or random events and personalizes it to their own circumstances or person.
All right, let me stop you there because I think you explained that. Can you give us an example of that?
The example would be someone who hears something on the television and believes that that is a reference to themselves personally and reacts to that.
Okay. And now continue on.
He had thought broadcasting. This is the idea that people are putting thoughts in your mind, or your thoughts are going into other people's minds. It is noted in my admission that it's possible he was hallucinating. Although he did not admit to that, he later admitted that he had been hallucinating. His demeanor and stance was marked by significant paranoia, and as indicated by statements such as, "I've given out too much information already," and it was these primary symptoms that led to the basis for diagnosis of schizophrenia.
All right. Jumping back for a second, the probable hallucinations, you said he did not admit to any. Is it uncommon for the mentally ill to deny hallucinations?
It varies, but it's not unheard of. Sometimes people will try to hide that from others because it is such a severe symptom.
Once you make that initial evaluation, do you start him on medication then immediately?
The diagnosis and symptoms were quite sufficient for me to make the recommendation that he initiate treatment with antipsychotic medications and other adjunct medications. At the time of admission, Mr. Jonchuck voluntarily agreed to start Haldol and Cogentin as initial medications.
What's Haldol do?
Haldol is a antipsychotic medication.
All right. And then what's the Cogentin do?
Cogentin is prescribed to prevent or reduce side effects that may occur while taking the medication Haldol.
Is Haldol a fairly typical start to when you're trying to address the psychotic features? Is that a fairly common beginning point?
Yes, sir. It's been in the psychiatric armamentarium for this condition or similar conditions for over 40 years. It's a very reliable medication and can be given both orally and by injection. There's also a long-term time-release type of injection that can be used. So it's a versatile medicine of proven worth.
What does Mr. Jonchuck get now?
Mr. Jonchuck is getting the long-term injectable Haldol and also oral supplement Haldol.
Okay. When you start that medication, you go through the intake process, you start the medication, how is that it for you? Do you see him then once a month, or what happens after that initial intake?
We have minimum requirements as a recovery team where we meet formally with all residents for the first month on a weekly basis, and minimum requirement for monthly visits after that. With the acuity such as Mr. Jonchuck had, I was receiving information and making interactions with him far more often. The counselor would come with information about his condition and behavior. The nurse would be seeing him daily, sometimes 3 times a day, to dispense medication and would be giving me feedback. I would also go to his resident building and conduct evaluations, and so that varies quite a lot, but in Mr. Jonchuck's case, I was in contact with him very frequently, at least in the initial few months of his treatment.
Is that an indication of the severity of his mental illness?
Yes, sir.
Now, we talked about your initial diagnosis. Has it changed?
Yes, it has.
And how long after your initial diagnosis did your diagnosis change?
It was a few months after admission that it became clear to me that there was a mood or affective component to his illness. It's not uncommon for the initial symptoms that I described to permit a diagnosis of schizophrenia, with an additional change to a more complex diagnosis called schizoaffective disorder, in this case bipolar type, as more observations of the individual occurs. And this is what occurred in this situation. He had a very difficult first few months in our facility.
So, when your diagnosis changes, does that mean he's not schizophrenic? Or is this new diagnosis a combination of schizophrenia with other things that are wrong with him?
I think your latter description is more apt and more appropriate to the understanding of schizoaffective disorder. It has all the components of schizophrenia with additional components of a mood disorder, in this case, bipolar mood disorder.
Okay. In layman's terms, that means that what he has is worse than schizophrenia?
Yeah, I would consider it to be more complex and require more treatment. Usually mood stabilizers or antidepressants are utilized to help the individual with the mood components of the illness.
And then once you made that diagnosis, were there then additional medications added?
Well, we spent some time finding a regimen for Mr. Jonchuck with the difficulty of the admission. We eventually added another antipsychotic that has calming properties and mood stabilizing properties called Seroquel. He also was given a anti-anxiety medication called clonazepam to help him with agitation and anxiety and stress. He was eventually given Wellbutrin, which is an antidepressant medication to help cope with depressed feelings. He was receiving a medicine called Neurontin or gabapentin in a small dose, in part for anxiety, and also in part for chronic pain management. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Cogentin, a side effect medication, was prescribed throughout to prevent various side effects that can come with the use of Haldol.
So these are not in place of Haldol, they're in addition to the Haldol?
Those were his additional medications, essentially the same at both of his stays at our hospital, with some minor dosage differences. These were the recommended medications at the time of both discharge from our facility.
Do you recall how many treatment team meetings you had in Mr. Jonchuck's case?
I can't give you a number, but due to the extensive time he's been there, the recovery team would have met at least 40 times.
Now, there's also something called a critical risk assessment. That's also an additional type of meeting?
Yes, sir. It's often a smaller group. It consists of myself and the counselor and possibly the nurse or others. But it's an assessment in between the recovery team meetings. It's an indicator of the acuteness of the individual's illness and the need for assessment of their risk to themselves or others.
And how many times do you think that team met?
Oh, I'd say at least double the other. I'd have a hard time. We've done over 5,000 of those critical risk assessments in our facility since initiation of the process 5 years ago. And they're done frequently. I do 3 or 4 a day in my routine use, routine duties, and I have approximately 45 patients to take care of.
Thank you. Doctor, did Mr. Jonchuck, when he arrived at your facility, did he exhibit symptoms of severe psychosis?
Yes, sir. As I mentioned earlier, those list of symptoms with thought blocking, ideas of reference, thought broadcasting, paranoia, and probable or possible hallucinations are all indicative of a psychotic mental state.
Does psychosis interfere with your memory?
The memories are to varying degrees interfered with because of psychosis.
Does the level of the psychosis correspond to the level of the effect on the memory?
Roughly, yes.
In your treatment of Mr. Jonchuck, I guess specifically, but mentally ill people in general, you focus a lot on hallucinations or probable hallucinations?
Well, different practitioners have a different emphasis. In my opinion, you should not focus too much on the individual's hallucinatory experiences. It's because generally there's not a lot of information to be obtained in a positive way, and attention by the individual on the hallucinations has a tendency to increase their frequency. And so often you adopt a listening attitude, the individual, would adopt a listening attitude and say, oh yes, I'm hearing them. And that's to be avoided because the arguing or interacting with auditory hallucinations tends to increase their frequency, and over time their natural history is to become more negative and demeaning and threatening and commanding, and the individual suffers because of those interactions and what they're hearing. So typically it is my practice to hear what's going on, use that as part of changing or not changing the treatment, but advise the person to distract themselves with music, reading, television, conversation, and other things to avoid encouraging further increases in the voices themselves.
And does the use of medications to reduce the psychosis, does that reduce the hallucinations?
Often it does, not always, but very often. It's one of the measures of effectiveness of the medication if the frequency, tone, and interactions or actions by the voices are reduced.
You mentioned that you were not asked to form an opinion as to Mr. Jonchuck's sanity or insanity at the time of the offense. Are you aware that other experts have been asked to form those opinions?
Objection, relevance.
Sustained.
When you make your diagnosis, are you relying on any, well, did you concern yourself with any reports regarding insanity at the time?
No, I did not. Did not use any reports to form my diagnosis.
They're not relevant to you at all, is that correct?
Well, we do receive outside reports in regard to the individual's competency. Sometimes they include an opinion on insanity, but even if I read that, I would not have used that or needed that to make my diagnosis.
You, as I recall, you make your diagnosis right after the intake, right?
At the time of admission, yes. And with the subsequent amendment, as I spoke earlier.
Yeah, and I'm not interested in the hows and whys, but he's been at your facility twice.
Yes, sir.
The entire time he's at your facility, are you his treating physician?
I was, yes.
Judge, if I could have a moment.
Sure.
I wanted to talk about the medicines just for a second. You said Haldol, he gets injections and pills,
Yes, sir.
and does he need both of those?
We found that to be an effective combination, and I'm hesitant to change something that works well.
Tell me about that. I mean, does the medication regime does it change?
His medication has been fairly stable after the initial search for optimum combinations and dosages.
Okay, so it's probably not using medical terms here, but so do you tinker with the medications till you get it right?
Yes, sir. There's some trial and error, some experience that one gains over the years in assessing response patterns. In this case, it took us a number of weeks or even months to find an optimal dosing regimen that treated both aspects of his illness, both the cognitive problems as well as the mood problems.
Has your treatment regime made a marked difference in Mr. Jonchuck?
I believe it has made a marked difference, yes.
Again, I guess not a medical term, but is he a different person now than he was when he got to you?
He's certainly a more agreeable individual, more realistic, more relatable, and much safer to others in his environment.
Does that mean that he's cured, he's not mentally ill anymore?
No, sir. These type of illnesses, unfortunately, we do not have the medical knowledge or ability to cure an individual. We are at this stage in our understanding and treatment can only provide treatment to reduce symptomology and stabilize the individual, which I believe, is not a minimal thing in and of itself.
Explain to the jury a little bit about mental illness in regard to I'm trying to think of, for instance, of is mental illness a medical condition that remains constant? I don't know if they're like high blood pressure. I mean, you get high blood pressure on Monday. Do you have high blood pressure on Tuesday and Wednesday?
Well, mental illness is not a unitary phenomenon. In fact, within the range of descriptors of schizoaffective disorder or even schizophrenia, we divide them into severe and less severe and not so severe. So it comes in different strengths and presentations. We group them together because they do share in common certain elements. Schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder share among themselves a problem with thinking, a basic problem with thinking accurately. The environment that the individual lives in affects their stress level, and stress levels are known risk factors for relapse of illnesses from physical to psychiatric or mental. So a high-stress environment is more likely to precipitate an illness episode than a low-stress environment. Also, compliance with medication is a major concern. We believe that going on and off medications is harmful to the individual and makes their condition worsen over time. So once a regimen is found, we feel the best treatment is to continue the treatment that works. That's our best recommendation today. But mental illness does rise and fall in its impact on the individual's lives, more so, I think, than physical illnesses.
And can that rise and fall be daily?
Sometimes it is, but it's not usual. In the time scale of schizoaffective disorder, and in general and in particular to Mr. Jonchuck, it has fluctuations and described in months rather than days.
You mentioned that there was one other medication, Wellbutrin. You said you gave that. He's prescribed Wellbutrin.
Yes, sir.
And is he prescribed a relatively high dosage of that?
Yes.
Is he prescribed about the highest dosage you can give him?
Yes. According to the FDA, that's the maximum dose.
Are you giving him any medicine that he doesn't need?
Not in my opinion.
Would medicating someone that doesn't need it, wouldn't that violate the Hippocratic Oath?
It certainly would run the risk of doing so. To do no harm to the individual is one of the primary codas of our profession.
Yeah, and I kind of just jumped into that. I'm sorry. The Hippocratic Oath, that's something that all doctors take?
Yes.
All doctors live by that?
Yes. Well, they should.
And one of the main tenets of that is do no harm?
Yes, sir.
And is it your opinion that wrongfully medicating someone would be doing them harm?
Yes.
In part of your duties at the hospital, is it part of your responsibility to try to find or look for evidence of people that are faking?
Yes, sir. The statistics on that is that is not an uncommon phenomenon, that individuals will exaggerate or feign illness in the situations that we find them at our facility.
And if they're in your facility faking, they're taking up a bed space that should go to someone else, right?
They certainly are unnecessarily there, yes.
Ever have any indication that Mr. Jonchuck's faking anything in his mental illness?
No, sir.
Now, you mentioned that he had a diagnosis when he initially came in, and then that it had changed to that it had changed from schizophrenia to a illness that included that with additional factors. You also mentioned that there's levels of that, I think you said, levels of his diagnosis. Am I right in that?
Levels of severity.
And what is his level?
Is high.
Severe?
Severe, yes.
Yeah, okay. And then what's below that he's not?
Well, lesser affected individuals.
Okay.
More moderate symptoms, less and shorter duration of illness.
And that was that severe diagnosis was made some 45 or after his initial intake?
Yes.
And has anything changed that would change your diagnosis of him?
No, sir.
So he continues this day to be, and tell us that diagnosis again?
Ask and answer, Judge.
he continues this day to suffer the same.
Jackson, answer, Judge.
Okay, I guess everybody agrees he's the same. Thank you, Judge.
Judge, we approach?
Yes.
Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon.
One of the things Mr. Williams brought up was about medicating someone. Can there be disputes as to what a proper medication should be between doctors?
There are alternative medications, yes, and the doctors will sometimes have a difference in opinion as to what's best for an individual.
As a matter of fact, you sometimes it takes, even you have to tinker with your own idea of what medication should be to be effective.
Yes, sir.
You indicated that psychotic people can have memories of the event, of an event in the past?
Their memories can be, but often fragmented and partial.
And you believe this defendant, Mr. Jonchuck, has a memory of the murder?
I have not surveyed his memory of the events that are subject to this trial.
Do you have any, you asked him, did you talk to him about what occurred, right?
Our competency approach has one of the areas that the individual should have the ability to relate to their attorney their version of the events.
And did he relate?
We do not require that to be a detailed recitation to us, as we find that often harms the individual's relationship with us, and they are fearful that that information will be revealed.
Did he give you such a recollection of the events?
Only with broad strokes and sufficient to our needs, at which time we no longer inquired.
And what was that broad stroke?
That he had committed the offense in respect to his daughter.
He indicated he dropped her off the bridge.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And so when asked if he had a memory of the events, you would agree that he has some memory of the events?
I can't say absolute certainty of that. He recognized the fact of, or the event as true.
And you're not hired to determine, or you weren't, not part of your job is to determine whether he was sane at the time?
That is correct.
Okay. When he first appeared, did he have stress situational? Am I saying that correctly?
He had high stress, in our opinion, due to his circumstances.
Okay. And that's when he was admitted?
Yes.
And what does that mean?
Well, he was aware that he had significant charges against him, that his offense would and could possibly lead to unfavorable circumstances and outcomes to him.
We're talking about legal.
Legal and others.
Okay. And what was his quote regarding that?
If you allow me a moment, since you're asking for a quote, I'd like to reference it. I can paraphrase it to you if that's sufficient for your needs.
All right, what's the pair?
I am so screwed.
Okay. And he indicated he was very depressed over that legal situation?
Yes.
On a scale of 1 to 10, he thought he was a 10 in
Yes,
depression?
that is correct. We often give people the opportunity to measure their feeling states on a 1 to 10 scale.
Okay. A moment.
Anything further?
No further questions, Judge.
Dr. Williams, be excused or stand by?
Questions, Judge?
Be excused, Judge.
Excuse me.
Judge, questions?
Questions? Okay.
He may be excused, Judge.
Dr. Williams, you're excused. Thank you for testifying.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Call your next witness.
Defense calls Heather Davis. Heather Davis.
Step right over here for me. You stand right here, moment, face this close, raise your right hand, here, take you.
You do solemnly swear affirm to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
And ma'am, if you would, have a seat in the red chair. Sure you're speaking loud and clear voice to the court, and just make sure you walk close to the mic.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon.
Sorry.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
If you could please turn and introduce yourself to the jury, go ahead and spell your last name for the court reporter.
My name is Heather Davis, Davis.
And Ms. Davis, how are you employed?
I'm the Counseling and Social Service Supervisor at North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center.
All right, and what does, well, let me back up a little bit. Do you have a bachelor, what's your bachelor's degree in?
I have a bachelor's in psychology from the University of South Florida.
Do you have a couple master's degrees?
I do. I have a master's degree in rehabilitation counseling, also from the University of South Florida, and a master's in human resource management from Troy University.
Your current job as the Counseling and Social Service Supervisor, what does that entail?
We have a department of 12 counselors that oversees the group and individual counseling crisis management for the residents at the facility where I work. We write court reports, we write social histories, treatment plans for the residents.
And do you hold any state or national licenses to do the work you do?
I'm a certified rehabilitation counselor, which is a national licensure.
And does that require some kind of continuing education hours?
Yes, ma'am. It's 100 hours every 5 years.
All right. Is anyone paying you to be here today?
No.
Okay. Have you been asked to render an opinion in the case regarding Mr. Jonchuck's sanity at the time of offense?
I have, but I have no opinion about it.
Okay.
I mean, people have asked me if I have an opinion, but I do not.
As far as any of the attorneys in this case?
No.
Okay. And you're not going to be testifying to that today, correct?
No, I'm not.
Okay. What is your prior involvement dealing with the same kind of work? What's your work experience?
Okay. I worked for 15 years in the Florida Department of Corrections as a psychological specialist. So usually at the psych camps is what they call them, where people need therapy and crisis intervention, medication monitoring, that type of thing. And then for 2 years, I was the unit supervisor for a voc rehab office in Ocala. And then I've been at this facility, North Florida Evaluation and Treatment Center, for 5 years. The first 2, I was a counselor, and then I got promoted.
Okay. And do you know Mr. Jonchuck?
I do.
And when did you first come in contact with Mr. Jonchuck?
When Mr. Jonchuck was admitted to the facility, he was assigned to my caseload, so I met him during the admission process.
And was that prior to your promotion?
Yes.
Okay, so were you his assigned counselor when he first came in?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Were you present for the initial intake?
Yes, I was.
Who all is present for the initial intake when somebody comes in?
The doctor, the psychiatrist, in this case Dr. Williams, the counselor, which was myself. We have someone called a qualified mental health professional. He was there, a nurse, a registered RN, and we have someone called a behavior specialist. And then there's a psychologist that may or may not attend.
Okay. What date did Mr. Jonchuck's initial intake occur?
I believe it was March 11th, 2015.
Okay. And during that observation, what is the purpose of the initial intake?
Well, we have very little information about them when they first come in, so we need to meet them to determine the severity of their problems, if they're having mental health issues that may or may not be treated with medication, to determine a level of care for them, to gather information about their history to see if that could help in future treatment.
Did the team, did you guys reach a decision or a conclusion on whether Mr. Jonchuck suffered from mental illness that could respond to treatment potentially?
Objection, can we approach Robert?
Yes.
So your initial intake of Mr. Jonchuck, what did you observe at that time?
Well, he was having some paranoia. He indicated that there was some type of thought broadcasting because he indicated he thought I specifically could read his thoughts. Later on, when we were walking him to his living area, there were some statements made that he also thought I was inserting thoughts into his mind. And he has like a back stimulator because he has an old injury. And so he was paranoid that people, including the people on the treatment team, wanted that back stimulator. And if they got that, then they would be in control. So there was several symptoms.
Were you or anyone else on the treatment team trying to insert thoughts into Mr. Jonchuck's head?
No, I don't have that ability.
Were you trying to control his spinal stimulator?
No.
Okay. But he was, how did you know that he thought you guys were able to do that?
Because he would make comments related to it. You know what I'm thinking. Quit reading my thoughts. Quit telling me that, and when I hadn't talked.
Okay. What about ideas of reference? Did you observe any of those?
Yes. When you get there, the place where the admissions are done, it's like a glass bubble. And so you can see other people around. And he felt that when other people were talking out there, whether it was related to him or not, he thought it was about him. And basically people were just going along on their work day. It really wasn't about him.
Right. So the way it's set up, there's kind of like 3 or 4 different like fishbowl rooms, right?
Right.
And then that's in the middle of basically a nurse's station, correct?
Correct.
So do a lot of people walk by there that would have had nothing to do with Mr. Jonchuck's recovery team?
Yes, that's our clinic. All admissions come through there, and then when people come to see the medical doctors, they come up there also. It's a very busy place.
At that point, was there anybody that had said anything to you that would have been talking about Mr. Jonchuck? Had any idea about it?
No.
Okay. What was his demeanor?
He was agitated. He wasn't very friendly. Specifically, he seemed more agitated with me than the rest of the team. So at some point, we shifted seats a little further away because it's a pretty small little room, and we just sit around a table. So at some point, the Q, Tristan, kind of pushed my seat over.
Okay. Were you able to ascertain why he was more agitated with you than anyone else?
No.
Was he accusing other people of reading his thoughts?
No.
When you tried to ask Mr. Jonchuck about why he was there, was it clear to you whether he knew what the allegations were initially?
No, it wasn't, because he was asking about his daughter. So the implication was, if he's asking where is she, that he didn't know and was unaware.
Okay. So was he able to relay that, what was he able to relay initially, that he was there because of the accusations?
Your Honor.
Okay. Was there some inconsistency between and whether he knew what had happened to Phoebe or not?
There was inconsistency.
Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, for the first several weeks, probably going into 2 months, he would constantly ask, where is she? How is she doing? Why can't I talk with her? And so we would give vague answers because we didn't feel like at that point he was ready for us to give him the whole picture, because he was having so many symptoms and we needed to focus on those first.
Okay. At some point, was there a point that you were able, that Mr. Jonchuck understood that his daughter was no longer alive?
Yes, the team decided together that his symptoms were controlled enough on the medication to tell him exactly what happened. So that's my role as the counselor to do that. We were afraid of how he would respond because he had had some incidents where he was aggressive.
Can we approach?
Yes.
Okay, so I want to go back to where we are. You said at some point that job kind of fell on you as his counselor, right?
That's correct.
Tell us about that.
We had some concerns about him potentially becoming aggressive or violent or acting out in some way when we told him. So we have a fenced-in area that's kind of small that has a picnic table there. So we had security escort us there. They were kind of on the perimeter, and I sat on the picnic table and I told him that she had passed away from an incident that he was involved in where he dropped her off a bridge.
And what was his response to that?
He was crying first, and I expected that, but then after some point, he became like no emotion, numb, shock, something like that, and then asked to go to his room. So we allowed him to go back and just monitored him, and he was like that for several days.
Did it appear that when you relayed that to him, it gave him some kind of finality or some kind of concrete understanding?
Speculation. And irrelevant.
And bleeding sustained.
How often do when was this conversation that you had with him?
I would say it was probably in May, but I cannot remember an exact date.
Of 2015?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
So, after he'd been there a couple months.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that before, or is that during the time that Dr. Williams is still tweaking his medication and trying to get him stable?
Yes, ma'am.
Once you got promoted, are you still John's counselor?
Yes.
Okay, so you supervise the other counselors, but you still have residents of your own?
Yes.
Okay. How often do you come in contact with him?
2 to 3 times a week.
And has that been since January 2015?
I saw him more when he was initially first admitted because I was housed on his building, like my office was in the building where he was living. And eventually he got moved on to another building, and when I got promoted, I got moved out of the housing units. So that I feel like I saw him less, that 2 to 3 times was less than when I was originally assigned.
Okay, so at the very low end of the times you see him, it'd be 2 to 3 times a week?
Yes, ma'am.
Gotcha. What are... I just forgot my question. The recovery team, is that the same team that does the initial intake?
Yes, it is.
Okay.
Except there's like one more person, someone we call a rehab therapist.
Okay.
And then we try and get a building representative to come down and participate, someone who works in the housing unit to talk about things that might have happened in the evening time or on weekends when the team is not present.
Okay. How often does the recovery team get together?
The recovery team meets initially for the first 4 weeks every week. After that, we see our residents once a month. And then if something were to happen where we're seeing more symptoms or there's been an event, then we could meet again spontaneously.
When John first came in, were you guys having more frequent recovery meetings?
Yes, because he had several incidents of aggression, and so whenever that happens, the team gets together to determine how to handle that in terms of his level of care.
Residents have different status at the hospital, is that right?
That's correct.
Explain that to us, would you?
Okay, so the highest status that a resident at the facility can get is called RA, which means resident alone. They can go anywhere in the facility by themselves without being escorted by a staff member. The next one down would be RS, which is resident with staff, which means they can't go off their living quarters, their building, without a staff member present. But they could go to groups and things like that as long as the staff goes with them. After that, you have pod status, where they have to stay in their living quarters and can't go off the building. Below that, we get to more intensive statuses. For example, you can be pod status and have what we call a close observation, which means someone checks on you specifically every 15 minutes to see what you're doing. After that, you would have a group observation, which means somebody's supposed to be in a room observing you at all times. The next step below that would be a one-to-one, which means that a staff member is supposed to be within arm's length of you. And the lowest status that we would have would be a 2-to-1 with security, which means that not only do we have the staff member that has to be within arm's length, but we also have to have a security officer present to handle any situation that may arise.
In the first couple months that John was at the center, what was his status?
His status was, it varied between 2-to-1 with security and 1-to-1 constantly.
Has that changed over time?
Yes. By the time he left, he was RA status and had been for quite some time.
Do you think that has anything to do with the medication?
I believe it does.
Well, let me ask you this. Is that something can you get more freedom and then have it taken away?
Absolutely.
So it's constantly changing?
Yes.
Okay. I suppose the level of freedom they have, what is that based on?
That's based on how stable they are, how likely they are to follow the rules, not to harm someone else, not to do things to harm themselves, and they have to be fully participating in their treatment, meaning someone's not going to get RA status if they're not going to group or not taking their medication.
Gotcha. Is that something that's usual, that when somebody comes in before you get everything kind of, all the kinks worked out, there on a lower status?
Our usual standard for a new admission that we don't think is going to be aggressive is pod status with a CO, which is the 15-minute checks. But John was on a lower status than that because of the amount of aggressiveness we felt, the anger, and the level of his symptoms.
Is there a correlation between, I guess, the extent of symptoms that somebody is exhibiting or suffering from and their status?
Yes.
So the more symptoms they have, usually the lower status?
That's correct.
Okay. And as of at least the last 6-9 months, he's been a model resident?
Yes, he had a couple incidents, I believe, where one time he was caught trafficking an item, but I think it was a food item. You know, that we don't call that a major infraction. What they do is they reduce his status until I show up or someone in the team shows up to address the situation, then he can earn it back. But he never went back down to like 2-to-1 with security.
Gotcha. What do you mean by trafficking an item? It sounds serious.
I know it sounds really bad, but we have this thing where residents are not allowed to pass items, personal items, food, anything like that between them, because that could be construed as I owe you, you owe me, and we don't want those type of relationships to form. So we're very strict about not passing items.
Okay, so if I were to give somebody my apple, that would constitute
as trafficking.
Gotcha. Did Mr. Jonchuck, did you observe a change in the psychotic symptoms or a difference in the psychotic symptoms that you observed at intake as time progressed?
Yes, they diminished.
Okay. Was that something immediately or did that take time?
Oh, no, that took time.
Was Mr. Jonchuck, did you believe he was having hallucinations at intake?
Objection to approach game.
Yes.
did you see indications that he was having hallucinations?
Yes, ma'am. He appeared to be responding to internal stimuli.
And could you explain that, what that means to the jury?
Well, someone who's hearing voices will sometimes disengage from the conversation and appear as if they're listening to something else, or ask an irrelevant question like, do you hear that? Or did you say that? And we were getting those kinds of responses from Mr. Jonchuck.
Gotcha. A little over a year, or right about a year after Mr. Jonchuck came to the hospital, he came back to the jail, right?
That's correct.
And do you know how long he was at the jail?
I would say it was only like 4 to 6 weeks. He was not gone a long time.
When he came back to the hospital, did you notice a change from when he had left the hospital in March of 2016 to when he came back those 4 to 6 weeks later?
Well, on the day that he arrived back at the facility, I was out at a training and did not do the intake. So I saw him the next day, and yes, I did see a difference in his presentation.
Okay. What is malingering?
Malingering, it means that someone's feigning symptoms of a mental illness. It could mean that the person doesn't have a mental illness at all, and they're faking that they do, or that they have a mental illness, but they're faking that it's more severe than it really is.
So exaggerating?
Yes.
Perhaps? Okay. Do you or the recovery team as a whole do any kind of testing or checking for malingering?
Well, if we have questions about that, the psychologist does a routine evaluation approximately 4 weeks after admission, and we will ask them to include a battery of tests that we'll see if they're likely to be exaggerating.
Okay. And were any tests performed on Mr. Jonchuck?
There were 2 tests that were performed, and the indication was that he was not feigning mental health symptoms.
That he was not?
That he was not.
Okay. And have you ever had a reason, in your years of fairly constant contact with Mr. Jonchuck, have you ever had a reason to believe that he was malingering?
No, I have not.
Have you observed anything that causes you to disagree with the diagnosis of schizoaffective?
No.
Sustained.
Do you and Dr. Williams consult regularly?
Yes, we do.
Do you, obviously not now, but up until a couple weeks ago when John was brought back here, were you guys still having the recovery meetings and such?
Every month.
With the current medication that John is prescribed now, have you noticed a change in his level of psychosis?
I don't see the symptoms that were present during the first admission or the second admission. He's more grounded in reality. He can have conversations about you, about real things that exist. He has not accused anybody of reading his mind, going after the back stimulator, and he appears less paranoid. I have not seen evidence of paranoia in quite a while.
Does that seem to correlate with his level of agitation and anger also?
Yes, he has not had an act of aggression in a year, maybe even more.
And do you still ask about his symptoms regularly?
Yes, we ask about it in the treatment team meeting, but I also ask about it individually when I meet with him.
When you meet with him individually, are those set meetings? Do you just reach out to him from time to time? He reach out to you? How does that come about?
Well, he always has the option to request to speak with me through the building staff, and then they call me, and I'll go find him if he's in group or on the building and speak with him. And then sometimes I might have something I need to talk with him about, so I'll go speak with him.
Have you noticed that stress affects John's behavior?
Yes.
Could you explain that a little?
I think that when he becomes stressed, his anxiety level's high, so he sleeps a little less. It's more difficult for him to sleep. He has some racing thoughts. It's hard for him to keep focused. And he sleeps more in the daytime to kind of avoid people. So I guess he's up at night but sleeps during the day. And that's just a way not to be around the stressors, to avoid others.
And have you, at this point, you have an understanding of certain situations or things that might cause stressors? Do you try to do anything preemptively?
Yes.
Explain that, if you would.
Okay. If I know, for example, that his mother's been trying to get a hold of him because she would leave messages on my voicemail, then I would go talk to him about that, because sometimes their interactions can be upsetting to him. At other times, like if he's had a legal visit or a visit from someone or an evaluation of some sort, then we would check on him afterwards to make sure that he's doing okay and doesn't need an increased level of care.
Do you guys have a library at the hospital?
We do.
What kind of books?
Well,
This is irrelevant.
I could just ask the question, but
Yeah, why don't you do that?
do you have any books about psychiatry or psychology in there?
no, we do not put those books in there,
And what is the reason for that?
because we don't want people to look up specific symptoms and start to feign or malinger them.
May I have a moment? I have nothing further. Thank you, Ms. Davis.
You okay with this, John?
Yes, ma'am.
Cross?
Yes. Afternoon. So I just want to confirm again, you said you have no opinion about his sanity at the time of the murder, right?
That's correct.
And you all at the state hospital there in Gainesville don't do any independent investigation on the defendant's history, because there's no need for that in what you do, correct?
Well, we ask about their psychological history, and we attempt to get records if they're available to us, because sometimes knowing what they've been treated with in the past in terms of medication or therapy could be helpful in a starting point
Sure.
For current treatment.
And let me clarify, because I wasn't
Okay.
specific enough. What I mean is, you don't go out and conduct an extensive history of their life, their past experiences, where they've lived, things like that, correct?
No.
Right? You don't investigate or interview witnesses that were part of his core, group before he was hospitalized,
No.
correct? Right. That's what I mean when I'm referring to history, not necessarily medical history.
Okay,
You don't do that, correct?
we don't do that.
You don't interview witnesses and try and determine if he has any type of personality disorders, because that's not what you're tasked with doing, correct?
Well, we do diagnose people with personality disorders if we feel that they meet the criteria.
Okay, but that's not something where you go out and you interview witnesses to find
That's
out
correct.
if someone has psychopathy, for example, correct?
Correct.
And you mentioned the back stimulator in John's back,
Yes.
right? Now that's never worked, correct?
It's never worked since he's been at the facility. I believe it's missing some type of outer piece, and Mr. Jonchuck doesn't know where it is.
Right, and he doesn't need it because he just takes Tylenol and he's fine, right?
That's correct.
You said that there were 2 tests that were done for malingering. I just want to go over those with you so we're clear about what those are. One was the Ray 15-item memory test, correct?
Yes.
And that test was just administered to determine if he's attempting to portray himself as impaired in the area of memory, correct?
Correct.
And there was also the inventory of legal knowledge, right?
That's correct.
And that's 61 questions?
Yes.
Is that accurate? And that test is administered to determine if he's attempting to fake deficits in his legal knowledge, correct?
That's correct.
All right. So there was no specific test given to determine if he was malingering psychotic symptoms, correct?
Correct.
Okay. And at one point when he was at the hospital, or you can correct me if I'm wrong, could be more than one time, he was cheeking his medicines, correct?
That's correct.
And what does that mean, to cheek your medicines?
That means that when you put oral medication in your mouth, you hide it so that you can spit it out and get rid of it when you're not at the window anymore, where the nurse or a staff member is not looking at you.
And how many times did he do that?
Well, several. More than once. I don't have a definite number, but it's been an issue.
That was an issue with him, right? Also, in the beginning, him acting out and being aggressive towards staff was an issue as well, right?
That's correct.
You had behavior problems with the way that he was being aggressive with Dr. Williams and other staff members, correct?
That's correct. Also other residents.
Right. All right. Thank you. Have more, Your Honor?
Sure.
That's all I have.
Anything further?
Yes, Judge. Mr. Bolin asked you if the hospital diagnoses people with personality disorders. And you indicate if they have one. Is that right?
Correct.
Has Mr. Jonchuck been diagnosed by the hospital with personality disorder?
No, he has not.
Nothing further.
Anything further? Anything further?
No, Your Honor.
Okay. Ms. Davis, be excused, stand by.
We'd ask her to remain on standby, but she's going back to Gainesville.
Okay. So you would have to be available to return.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. For your testimony. Oh. Anybody have a question for Ms. Davis?
Oh, yeah,
I'm sorry.
Okay.
Back to the facility the second time. His presentation positive or negative, is that correct?
Yes.
Can you answer that for us?
His presentation was positive or negative?
When he came back the second time?
It was negative in that he was having more symptoms than when he left.
Does that answer your question, Ms. Russo?
Yes.
Anybody else have any questions? Okay, stand by. Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Council approach, please. gentlemen, we're going to adjourn for the evening. Tomorrow we will start at 9 o'clock. We might go till 6, but we might get out early. Because of witness coordination problems in this case, and it's a tough case for both these sides to try. It's not easy to get all these people here all the time. So no side is to blame, but there will be, this trial will not be reconvening on Monday, so you get Monday off. Tuesday we will reconvene at 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay, so full day tomorrow, maybe a little early, nothing on Monday, reconvene on Tuesday at 9 o'clock, and then the days will be very similar to this day. Yes?
Are we still projecting 3 to 4 weeks possibly?
Well, we're already at 2, because I count jury selection. Council approach, please. Well, don't you want to count it? You are all struggling through it one day or another, right?
Good.
I would say, but don't hold me to it, April 17th at the very latest, which would be, yesterday was the 7th, 1, 2, which would be a month from yesterday. At the very latest, I would say, I mean, we bandied about April 12th, that's a week from tomorrow, but I don't think that's probably realistic. So give or take April 17th, but I can tell more as the trial progresses because this is the long part of the trial, obviously.
Judge, April 12th is 2 weeks from tomorrow.
Oh, you're right, 2 weeks from tomorrow. that's the general. Any other questions? But we can do better as time progresses, okay? Thank you. See you tomorrow morning. We're done for the day, right? There's nothing else? Yes? Yes. Okay, have a good night.
All rise.